Tates, Mames streben, sehr Kinder euch zu geben, weil das ist die größte Freude bei sei.
Bonsoir et bienvenue sur Yiddish Radio, l'émission bimensuelle de la Maison de la Culture Yiddish, avec au micro, moi, Shahar Fineberg. Ce soir, j'ai l'immense plaisir d'avoir avec moi, pour un entretien à distance, Sapoznik, producteur, musicologue, interprète et écrivain, fondateur de l'archive sonore du YIVO à New York, créateur du Yiddish Radio Project, un projet sur la radio yiddish pour la radio américaine, projet pour lequel il a reçu le prestigieux prix Peabody en 2002. Il a également été nominé plusieurs fois pour des récompenses telles le Grammy et le Emmy pour son travail dans les domaines de la musique et de la culture yiddish américaine, traditionnelle et populaire. Bonsoir, Sapoznik.
Bonsoir. Thank you for having me.
It's my great pleasure. Henry, you have done so much in the realm of Yiddish culture, contemporary culture, 20th century culture, but in particular in Yiddish radio culture. And it's a privilege and an honor to be speaking with such a rebbe in this field that I dabble in and try to do my best at. And I want to just to start off, maybe hear the story of what eventually led to the Yiddish Radio Project, your work as the founder of the YIVO Sound Archives. How did that come about?
Well, the Yiddish Radio Project came out of the work at the YIVO Institute. That is, when I got there was no catalog as such. There was no what's called a discography. It's actually a French invention, the concept of discography. So records were documented by when they arrived, not any internal catalog or matrix system. So mixed in among the 1920s shellac pressed commercial records were these aluminum and in some cases glass records, which were one of a kind because they were radio shows, and they were mixed in, and not until a real catalog was created were we able to distinguish. And then, but there was no, once it became clear that these were out there, then it was a process of locating, continuing to locate the record, specifically looking for radio materials. Interestingly, just as an aside, right when we had this meeting, I had just gotten from the Library of Congress, which is where the collection is now. I just got, like yesterday, a thumb drive with pictures of all of the discs in the Yiddish radio collection, in my collection at the Library of Congress. I'm seeing a lot of these for the first time in 25 years. And I've just rediscovered some amazing materials that for some reason missed the first time. So the big project now, and if that the paper collection of the Yiddish radio materials, the scripts, photographs, internal memos, all the paper stuff, that's all cataloged, and I'll give a web address. So if people want to look at the PDF of the paper materials, but the discs are now going to be, a lot of them have never been transferred, have never been digitally transferred to a stable a medium, and that's what's going to hopefully, Mitzvah Shem, in the next few years going to start. So just when you asked this question, this rebirth of the collection is kind of starting again.
And that's all the more precious because a lot of these records are acetate, right? They're not meant to be played and replayed. Like if you play them only a couple of times, that's it, they're gone, right?
Correct. And what's heartbreaking is looking at the pictures again, I haven't seen some of these records in 25, 30 years. The acetate, the surface of the disc, because they're not pressed, because they are etched into the surface of the disc, the rubber surface where the signal, where the sound is, very delicate, very thin, and I'm seeing it breaking away in the pictures, breaking away from the aluminum or even the glass underneath it. During World War II, they used glass because all the aluminum was used for the war effort. So I'm actually seeing this physical deterioration. So every image is like a signal. So it's time is always against you. And even though the stuff is in the best possible place it could be at the Library of Congress, humidity and temperature control, active archivists, you know, the ne plus ultra of where you can hope. So anyway, the collection, such as it was, had to be pieced together. I was just noticing by looking at the discs, and I was kind of looking at the collection in a fresh eye, and I'm saying, of the 1,000 or so discs, about 1/3 were one collection, where it was this radio show, Rabbi Rubin, the Court of Peace and Justice, a base din of the radio. So about 300 of those records. It's a great, amazing Nes Min HaShamayim story about the saving of this collection. I don't know if, but and then another 200 belonged to another person who was on the air. Easily 2/3 of the collection was saved because someone involved in the production took the care to make sure that what they broadcast was kept. Not saying, oh, the producer will save it or the sponsor will save it. Someone took the responsibility of saving it themselves, and that's why it's preserved. And the rest is random. The rest is weirdly, entertainingly, freakishly random, and that's a nice balance.
So, from your work with this this archive that you cataloged at YIVO, you derived in the early 2000s the NPR show, right? The Yiddish Radio
Yes.
Project.
Yeah.
Some of the episodes are available online, and I recommend all of our listeners to go out and have a listen. But could you tell us a bit about the work you did there? Because there, in some of these episodes, you will use archival footage, and then also go and seek out people who may have been involved in the production of these records. So what was that like, the working on that project?
It was actually, you're right. It was two projects. The first version of the Yiddish, the first person who made me aware of the radio materials was a reporter named Andy Lancet, who worked for an independent radio station in New York, WBAI. He was an investigative reporter, and he came to the YIVO to do a piece about something else. And he came in, and he was he was a radio guy. So he came into my sound archives. He's looking. He says, "Oh, you have radio discs." I said, "Whoa, where do I have radio discs?" And he said, "These are aluminum." And he gave me this. I mean, so he raised my consciousness, and he became the first co-producer in conceiving a Yiddish radio documentary. And as an investigative reporter, he was we did terrific interviews with just, again, an investigative reporter knows how to find people, knows how to do a thorough process of tracking down leads. In fact, the coolest thing he did was, there's something called the Freedom of Information Act. I think we still have it now, thank goodness. And when we started the Yiddish radio research, which the series aired in 2002, And the research began around 1995 with Andy, around 1994, 1995. So when we started, we put in, because it was his idea, a request to the Freedom of Information Act to get the FBI files on radio station WEVD, which was the Yiddish radio station owned by the Forwards, the socialist Yiddish paper. And he and I naturally assumed, well, of course, the FBI would be interested in the doings of the socialists and the communists and so forth. So we put in to get these documents, which we assumed they had, to get them declassified. And then it took 7 years for the documents, the heavily redacted documents, to get to us. But the amazing thing we found was, between all of the blacked out copy about who the informers were, was that the FBI had 2 separate investigations. One is that they were getting the socialists at WEVD to inform on possible communists, but they were also getting other informants to inform on the socialists. So there were like these 2 really, so the whole thing was riven with deceit, and this is the atmosphere. So listening to the radio shows that were being produced at the same time, that it gives an incredible perspective to how the culture and the society functions on such an individual and in this case, a mass culture level. This was the most, EVD was the most popular of there were 100, over the years, there were over 160 stations that had Yiddish shows at one time or another. But anyway, it's great to have perspective.
And could you situate that in a time frame? When were the glory days of Yiddish radio?
It started, the first actual Yiddish broadcasts or date from like the mid 1920s, 24, 25. There's no evidence of that stuff. Recordings do not exist, but it's really the period of the glory days that really begin in the late 1920s with the concept, the imagining of Yiddish culture on the air, because it really, in a lot of ways, you have to see Yiddish radio as really the final pre-war sort of supernova of Yiddish culture. It was everything that preceded it. It was the last big technological outpouring of a dynamic Yiddish culture. It was literature, it was music, it was theater, it was news, it was commentary, it was religion, it was chazonis. It was every aspect of Yiddish culture hurtling to this historic moment. It was about to all stop, not end, but just stop. And that's why listening to these things, a jigsaw puzzle. It's an audio jigsaw puzzle that you put together.
During this time period, from I guess the 20s till the Hoban, the Jews are producing Yiddish culture in Yiddish for the Jewish community, and then others are making Hollywood in English for the Americans or the English-speaking Americans. Mm-hmm. And I saw somewhere that you wrote that there was that also the representation of Jews in mainstream American culture was usually just as tended towards the Yiddishkeit or schmaltzy kind of cliches about the Jews, whereas the Yiddish artistic production that was going on, especially in radio, that reflected an entire different pan of Yiddish cultural life.
When you look at American popular culture, and certainly when Jews first encountered it, in the late 19th century, it was just inventing itself. One of the reasons Jews could get involved, because it was entertainment like that. It was a business without a history of anti-Semitism. They could start in at the ground floor. And that was not a difficult thing, but how Jews were portrayed on the stage was Jews inherited how Jews were portrayed the same way they inherited the apartments they moved into on the Lower East Side. They just moved into the old theaters, they moved into the old apartments, and they moved into the old theatrical mode of doing things. And this was a challenge for Jews to reinvent not only how Jews were portrayed, but how Jews interacted with dominant American culture. How much do you let in? How much do you keep out? How much do you do a Yiddish version? How much do you completely ignore the American insistent culture? So radio, with its immediacy, you really still feel that they're talking to you. There's this one-to-one dynamic that even after all these decades, it really reveals a lot of the points that you're bringing up, a lot of the questions about how Jews are perceived, how we perceive ourselves, what we can say among ourselves in Yiddish that perhaps, can't be done. There was for example, from 1933 until the World War II, until the United States declared World War II, declared war on Germany and Japan in 1941, there were rules on the radio, the Federal Radio Commission, that said that America was neutral. Now, starting in 1933, Jews knew we were not neutral. There was absolutely no way. The Yiddish press was not hampered by this. You could do things in the press that you could not do on the radio, because the radio was regulated by the government in licensing, and the press was First Amendment. It was freedom of the press. So there was an odd imbalance about how Jews could discuss the imminent catastrophe that was happening. So what radio people had to do was trade on, and it was not hard, they traded on the basic literacy of the audience, their knowledge of Jewish history, their knowledge of Jewish ethics and Jewish traditions. And they were able to talk about the news of the day vis-a-vis the Jews, while apparently talking about historic figures, letting their listeners know straight and loud and clear what is going on. And it's really a brilliant outpouring of creativity, both as the Yiddish language and as a people taking charge.
So could you maybe tell us a bit about some of your favorite Yiddish radio programs or performances on your website and on the archives of the Yiddish Theater Project? There's luminaries such as the Jewish philosopher Lutzky, who was sort of Dr. Ruth before time.
Dr. Ruthless. That was more.
Sima Rechtzeit, the great Yiddish crooner, or Nuchem Stuchkov, right? The brilliant linguist and dramatist. What among these or others were some of your favorite pieces you discovered?
Oh, there's amazing stuff. Well, first of all, let me do this. Now that I see you're doing this, I have a website that I guess is almost seems like an aside, but I have a website that was my COVID lockdown project, was to create a website and to get the Yiddish radio stuff back out. Knowing what you're doing now, I will try to load up some stuff onto the website, and so that you can share that with your listeners. So maybe some of the stuff we're talking about doesn't have to be abstract, and people can actually listen to it. We'll work that out later, but it's just a thought that occurs to me. So what is perhaps the most amazing stuff that emerges from the Yiddish radio stuff. Still, the stuff with the greatest power, the stuff with the most astounding insight, are the radio which involves what is it? Tagtägliche Yidden. These unbelievable man on the street interviews, people coming out to quiz shows at grocery stores, and still the Rabbi Reuben, based in the Court of the Air. It's just unbelievably, it is the most powerful insight into Jewish life, both in an historic sense and in a visceral, ongoing human sense. It's the most astounding thing I've ever experienced. The simple, direct, uncomplicated, painful humanity that is on display of the people who turned out for Rabbi Reuben's Court of the Air for like 35 years. It's an amazing. I'm just looking at the discs for the first time in a long time, and there's lots of them. And for example, I came across one disc. There's a lot of information. One disc that has a grease pencil. You know what I mean by a grease pencil? It's not lead. The pencil isn't lead, but it's a kind of a grease. It's kind of like an oily base, so it writes, but it's not sharp. And it's called a grease pencil. You use it on things where you can easily wipe it off. Film, and in this case, these acetate records. And so anyway, it's this show of this based in, and in grease pencil is written right across the surface of the record. It says, "Do not play too much crying." And you know that they didn't, because Rabbi Reuben was very concerned about the dignity of the people who came on his show. So this was the first time that this had been heard, that I'm listening to this moment of this woman who is, I'm still moved. It was an issue about a son who promised to give her $10 a week, and he wouldn't do it. And it's this unbelievable. It's like, I can't believe I'm hearing this thing that is so personal and so powerful. And and I look on the record and it says, 1948. And it's jumps across the decades with an immediacy and a presence that is there is nothing else that I can think of that takes you so much into the presence of the moment. So it's tremendous material.
So you mentioned 1948, and how indeed does Yiddish radio change in America after the Churban in the 50s, the 60s, and with the rise of television as an important medium, and up until our days, if that's not too vast of a question, but if you could give us a panorama of the 50s until our days in Yiddish radio, and if there is anything left today.
Well, here's maybe, I don't know if maybe your listeners don't understand how radio historically functioned in the United States. Despite the fact that people had to get their licenses from the federal government, they were primarily privately owned. Unlike, again, like what you're on, it's completely government run. So there was an odd combination of both the mandate of government, but also the ruthlessness of the marketplace. So because of that, Yiddish radio had to find a place, usually among the poorer of the stations trying to survive, and would be given an hour or 2 hours a day to go out and find sponsors to pay for those 2 hours that they could then present the show. So that's the format.
Like the B. Manischewitz company, the world's largest matzah bakery, right? Presents.
Absolutely, that's right. The beat, and that was a whole other thing about what kind of sponsors do you get for Jewish shows? And of course, you would know what the answer, because Yiddish press tells you exactly who was already advertising to the Jews. So it was very easy, especially for a station that was owned by a Yiddish newspaper, which was in fact the Forward, owned WEVD, which was originally a socialist radio station. So by the time the post-war era, what had been New York between 1925 and 1950, there had been 25 radio stations in New York, which at one time or another had Yiddish shows on it. Even WEVD, which was owned by the Forward, was not Yiddish all the time. It was Yiddish only in specific times, but they became the major post-war station. What happened after the war was the slow decline of Yiddish radio. Nothing new was really being, it was the momentum of what Yiddish radio had been before the war that was slowly playing out after the war. So that, let's say by the time I started working at WEVD in the early 1990s, I was brought in to produce what had been the diamond in the tiara of Yiddish radio shows on WEVD, called the Forward Hour, which was this was their major showcase, because this is the newspaper was the Forward. So by the time I got there in 1990, 1992, the audience, there was kind of, I guess they were asking me because none of the old timers were left at this point. They had to, but also to bring in, hopefully, to try to bring in a contemporary approach to the re-interest in Yiddish culture, which was starting to happen in the 1980s. And EVD, the Forward, made an attempt to, well, it didn't, again, it was difficult because they didn't understand. It was a combination of reaching the audience they had always reached, as opposed to changing their outreach, changing their intention of who they wanted to reach. And that was sad that they made the effort to create the programming on the one hand, but made it hard to create an audience that would then become the base of saying, okay, we want more interesting, innovative, tiefe jiddische Programmen, wo es geben über die Tiefkeit und die Kunst von jiddischen Kultur. For younger Leute, I mean, for young people, this was still out of their understanding.
I guess in a sense, my coming to Yiddish is one of the end results of a process that must have started around that time, because I grew up in Jerusalem, and I discovered Yiddish in Europe once I moved to Paris, because I'm sure you know of the reputation and the stigma that Yiddish has in the state of Israel these days, since forever.
Yes, forever.
And I was shocked and surprised to discover that the world of contemporary Yiddish thought, creation, production, there's a lot of young people also who are interested in it. They can be Jews, they can be non-Jews as well. And it seems that there's an interest not only in the Yiddishkeit and the nostalgia, but in the shockingly innovative and profound pieces of culture that were produced by the enormous Yiddish boom between 1850 and 1950, let's say. And I think nowadays maybe things are starting to steer more in that direction in the realms of Yiddish culture. Let's talk maybe about what's going on these days and what you're working on these days, because I know that one of your big projects these days is on the Schwarze Chazonim, a fascinating story in and of itself, and also another testament to this place where Yiddish is and always testing the boundaries between things and mixing cultures and trying to find new ways to figure things out. So what's the Schwarze Chazonim all about?
Well, actually, it's, and you prefaced it really, really well. It's things like this, and one of the things that always interests me are when two separate forces come together and how they function. So, like in the case of Yiddish and radio, that creates an unanticipated third result. So too, I mean, the interesting thing is I have been on the trail of the Schwarze Chazonim for decades, having gotten like random kind of like just like unclear signals that there was this phenomenon of Schwarze Chazonim who were performing for the Jewish community, not in a shul, but on the stage, on radio, and on records. As it turns out, the one recording of a period Schwarze Chazan, Thomas LaRue Jones, finally, I'd been looking for this record for about 40 years when I first discovered that it existed, but it took 40 years for the record to turn up. And it was that recent discovery. The record turned up on eBay, you know, the great clearinghouse of the universe. What it did for me, by putting an actual sound, by putting an actual voice to this almost mythical phenomenon that turned out to be nearly a dozen, at one time or another, Schwarze Chazonim, including a woman, Goldie the Schwarze Chazante. It's such an amazing story, but having the recording and hearing the authenticity, at first I was many times over the years as I waited for the record to turn up and never completely gave up hope. It was always Lashana Haba, the record will turn up. It's but at some point I began to say, you know what? Maybe it's not like a real chazonis. Maybe it's just like some sort of a parody or a burlesque, or it's like, you know, because there were always Jewish artists making believe, you know, some sort of black kind of thing. So maybe it was going to be a blues. I didn't know, because until you hear it. And then as soon as I got it and I played it and I heard the unbelievable, deep, tiefe, Emisse, Yiddishkeit, der Kohl von der Yiddische Folk, all of the stuff that I had been reading about it, the hundreds of detailed period newspaper articles from the 20s and 30s about these guys, it was all true. And I was so moved by, and more so moved by the fact that not only had I discovered this record, but the research led me finally to find out where LaRue was himself buried, only to find that he was in an unmarked grave. And so it became this huge story about how we as Jews think, oh, well, you know, Jews and Black culture, and we're always co-opting it. You know, we're playing the blues, we're the record owners, we're the concert promoters, we're the theater owners, we're the managers. It's always the Jews kind of living off Black culture. But here is this completely Moshe Kapoyer, backwards, upside down, mit dem Kopf arup, where it's Blacks who have completely internalized and not just any Jewish culture, but an East European, a Yiddish, a real Ashkenazic, Hamisha, it's an amazing, unprecedented phenomenon.
Because we should say for our listeners that the Schwarze Chazonim, the black cantors, this is a phenomenon that takes place that starts off in Harlem, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the epicenter is Harlem in the late teens, early 1920s. And it's to do also with the Black Israelite movement. I mean, it's to do directly with the Black Israelite movement, where Blacks in Harlem, elsewhere in the country, I'm sure, they start to identify in the search for their own culture and the definition of their own culture. Some of them start to identify with the story of the Israelites. Some took it quite far also to claim that the white Jews were the fake
not
Jews.
Real Jews.
Not real Jews. The real ones that were black and brown.
Fabulous.
And you know what? I'm currently in New York, and I'm staying in Harlem. And I was thinking about it the other day. No relation, but I was thinking about it, and I said, it was during Pesach actually, and I was thinking about it. Why would they be attracted to that story? And it might be the 400 years of slavery also, the 400 years of slavery of the Jews in Egypt, and the 400 years of slavery of the blacks in the Americas, and it's such and the exodus from Africa, right? So this huge explosion of culture in the black world as well that produces the Harlem Renaissance also during the same years. Some of it streams off and goes into this Yiddish derivative, which is phenomenal.
It's an amazing moment, and you're absolutely right. The Harlem Renaissance, I don't believe, this is not heresy, this is just observational. The Harlem Renaissance would not have been the Harlem Renaissance without the momentum that the Black community experienced by encountering a Jewish community that was already dealing with a lot of stuff. The Yiddish theater, the Zionist movement, a lot of the stuff that became a real inspiration and model in the Black community was already being experimented with on street level in Harlem when the big migrations, the Jews were migrating from the East, the Blacks were migrating from the South. And it's an historic moment. So in fact, when we get done, and you should not have mentioned that you're in Harlem, because I have a big favor to ask you, which is to take pictures of some of the what are now churches in Harlem, which were Yiddish theaters, which is one of my big obsessions is putting together. I've discovered that one architect was responsible for the vast majority of Yiddish theaters built after World War I. And I'm like really hot to give him his honor for creating the spaces that Jews encountered Yiddish culture. And of course, several of them were in Harlem when it was really, this was in the days before the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side just gets better press, but Harlem was a real dynamic culture, not a small part because of the interconnection with the African American community. It was exciting, really everything was possible. So it's really a thrilling moment to encounter the again, like you're saying, in fact, there was one place that I'm trying to document. It's a vaudeville house in Harlem that specialized in bringing Schwarze Chazonim. So far, I've dug out two of the Schwarze Chazonim, the Mount Morris Theater, which became it's a church now. It became a Spanish theater. Anyway, the Mount Morris Theater in Harlem specialized in bringing in Schwarze Chazonim because they understood the power of reaching out to both communities especially as the dynamics and the demographics changed in Harlem. It's a real amazing moment when this came up. Now, of course, I'm looking for radio stuff, but that's going to be the Goldie, the Schwarze Chazante was on radio for quite a few years, but I've not been able to find any of the, not surprisingly, not find any of her broadcasts.
I actually was meaning to ask you about the synagogue, because in some of the pictures from the period of the Schwarze Chazonim, you see them standing in front of synagogues and shuls in Harlem, I think. So you said earlier in the conversation that the Chazonim wouldn't perform for the Jews in shul, but on stage. But did they have their own shuls where they would perform cantorial duties in Harlem?
Here's the thing. We're talking about two completely different stories. On the one hand are the Black Hebrews, people who were coming out, mostly emigres from the South, but also from the Caribbean, and people who are inspired by the Marcus Garvey Back to Africa movement on the one hand, and also inspired by the Clef Club, which was a Black music union for the emerging Black musicians and performers. So that's on the one hand. So the Black Hebrew congregations were growing organically within the Black community. On the other hand, were people like Thomas LaRue Jones, who was living in Newark, which also is a very big center for Yiddish culture and also jazz. But he grew up in a Christian home. He had a couple of siblings who were in Black vaudeville. But for some reason, he dedicated his life to performing on the fringes of the Jewish community. Never had a shul, but would perform concerts at Jewish synagogues. He would perform concerts in the Yiddish theater. I have a newspaper account of him helping to teach orphaned young boys their haftorahs. That's really deep community work. That's not what a performer does. So it's an odd story that on the one hand, he's a part of the Jewish community, but he's also apart from the Jewish community. And that difference is really big, because you would think, well, yeah, if there's an active Jewish community for which he's a chazan, it makes sense that he would, like for example, Moshe Oisha would go back and forth between being in a shul and being a chazan, but also being on the stage or being on the radio or being in movies. Thomas LaRue never had smicha as a chazan. And Goldie, the Schwarze Chazante, was even more detached from a Jewish community, where she would, on one hand, she would be Goldie, the Schwarze Chazante, performing for Jewish communities, or even appearing in an Olshanetsky musical. We think Alexander Olshanetsky is going to put some phony in one of his musicals. I don't think so. But then she's overperforming on a stage with Duke Ellington and Fats Waller. So what is going on? How is this code switching? How are they moving back and forth between a really deep Yiddish, culturally literate community and being not even having a shul, not even being, it's an unusual cultural, so this is what's coming out now. A lot will never be known, I'm afraid, because too much time. But the one good thing I can say is this renewed interest. I've now completed raising, there was a GoFundMe program to raise money for a headstone for Thomas LaRue Jones. So I'm really happy that worked out. And the plan is his yahrzeit. Well, I don't know whether he was, I don't know if he was Jewish or not. He's not in a Jewish cemetery. So I don't know what his yahrzeit, I mean, I know what his yahrzeit is on the Christian calendar, which is August 9th. So that's my plan, is to get the headstone on in time for that. And maybe a little closure, to do that.
Shkoyach. So to sum up, or before we end this fascinating talk, we learned about the Schwarze Chazonim, and thanks to you, you're the man who brought it to the forefront of our minds. But so, what can we expect in the near future from you? What are you working on aside from the Schwarze Chazonim? If you're willing to reveal such information.
Oof, man. No, there's a lot of, well, here's the thing. I mean, having materials with which to work. Like I said, I'm now going to get started going back through the 1,000 or so Yiddish radio shows that have been sitting in storage for 30 years. Stuff is going to come out of there. I just found a show I totally forgotten about, a 1946 radio drama called Displaced, about a Holocaust survivor, starring Paul Muni. And it's in English, but it's the only Jewish performance. Muni did not want to play Jews on the screen. He was not going to Hollywood. He performed every other ethnicity until The Last Angry Man, his last movie. That was the first time he played a Jewish character. So, but here, to hear him do this portrayal is quite powerful. So I think the radio collection will tell me what to do next. I'm just finishing up. I just have a talk I'm putting together. I've just started doing it on the history of Yenta Telebenda, which is something which has interested me since doing the Schwarze Chazonim, an amazingly interesting Yiddish character developed in the pages of the foreword and became a super popular theater, radio, and record character for many years. Not Yenta, as people think, a busybody gossip, but a really strong, don't get in my way kind of woman. And it's kind of interesting to look back at this fabulous history on this very interesting character. So that's happening. And of course, because I went back to these old radio shows, there is I refound a wonderful radio series, which were reductions, little tiny versions of classic Yiddish musicals of Goldfaden and early Rumshinsky. The only evidence we have of the vast majority of Yiddish musicals, what they sounded like and what was the quality of the performance, all started by a Jewish candy manufacturer who made one of the most popular candies called Chunky. And it's a great story. I'm just going through it now. It's really kind of amazing that and I'll be writing about. So there's Yiddish popular culture like this in Yiddish news, old Yiddish newspapers, these Yiddish radio shows, the 78s. I have thousands of 78s. There are fresh messages. There is great stuff in there waiting to be rediscovered and to make people just totally sit up and take notice. So no lack of wonderful projects ahead.
Fantastic. I'm extremely glad to hear it and extremely excited to see and reap the fruits of your work in the future. Henry Sapoznik, thank you very much for having been with us tonight on Yiddish Heint.
It was my pleasure. A shenem dank und wir kommen noch auf Simche zusammen.
Thank you, Henry.
Yes.
C'était Henry Sapoznik ici sur Yiddish Heint, cette fois-ci en anglais.
Vous pouvez vous rendre sur son site web henrysapoznik.com pour écouter les émissions radio dont on a parlé ce soir, ainsi que pour consulter les dossiers de ses recherches en cours. Terminons maintenant avec ce morceau de Thomas LaRue Jones, le Schwarze Hasen, qu'a mis donc 40 ans à arriver dans les mains de Henry Sapoznik. Le morceau s'intitule, comme par hasard, Yiddish verlier nicht dein Hoffnung. Juif ne perd pas l'espoir. Bonne soirée, à bientôt sur Yiddish Heint et bonne écoute.
Gott hat amol dem Jiden geschworen, als Jid wird kein Mol, nicht werden verloren, wie samt bei dem Jahr wird sich mehren, in welcher Sach den Himmel die Sterne, in wo ist geworden, in dem Jid hat Sinn. Der Goya der Scheune macht im Pogromen sein Blut halten fließen, fing wie in Stromen. Man verwirrt sein Leben als Schreck. In der Rot bei ihm alles weg. Der Säune dahin, hat gedeiht ihn, in hofft auf alles, fängt wie ihn mit Reim. Wie schon noch abo, wie Jerusalem, verlier nur nicht dein Hoffnung redit, es wird amul dir euer Frauen geht. Hara oma in amulek, hast gelernt mit dei Bulek, war dei dir schrecken, dass sie kein Mul nicht. Arunter ist Nikolai, bin Feulen, wisst ihr euer sein frei. Verlier nur nicht dein Hoffnung redit. Verlier nur nicht dein Hoffnung redit. Es wird amul dir euer Frauen geht. Hara oma in amulek, hast gelernt mit dei Bulek, war dei dir schrecken, dass sie kein Mul nicht. Vielen wird mit dir bekovet, in dem Land in Morgen dovet. Verlier nur nicht dein Hoffnung redit.